Hello and welcome to Writing Today. In this episode, I'm going to be doing some top tip video. This time it'll be 10 top tips that'll work with no matter who you are and what you are writing. The past few weeks, I've been specifically tackling the fantasy genre with my fantasy writing toolkit, which I highly recommend you check out if you are interested in writing in that genre. It's a bundle of information on all aspects of fantasy writing. But I have then been neglecting the other genres that I could be talking about. So in this top tips, I'm going to be addressing all genres as a whole with some advice that'll work with whatever the situation is. So I've collected some of my top tips and I'm going to be talking about them in this video. If you're interested in checking out some of my work, you can find it all on thepensleuth.com. There's a link to that in the description below. And I also have a free course available, which I highly recommend you check out. With that said, let's not waste any more time and get straight into the very first tip. Tip number 1 is to crush your bad habits often. Bad habits are most prevalent in the beginning when you have a set idea of how to write. It could be that you have always used said in dialogues and nothing else. Or you use qualifiers far too often, such as quite or rather. You might even repeat phrases, which isn't bad if you assign them to a character, but in narration, it comes off as amateurish. Now to clarify, bad repetition happens several times a chapter, not several times in a book. Of course, this does depend on the length. It is easy enough to spot when reading one's work closely. Returning back to the subject here about bad habits, you may crush all your bad habits in the beginning, but you'll always pick up new ones as the months go by. Which is why it's always important to take a moment to analyze your work. It's easy enough to spot these bad habits during the editing phase when you're reading your work so often. But the best practice is to be conscious of them when you are writing, so that way you can better avoid them during the writing process and won't have to deal with them so much in the editing process. Of course, this does bring us to tip 2, which is write now, edit later. A lot of time is wasted when a writer decides to break their writing flow to edit. When you start writing, you can feel yourself get into the swing of things. Momentum is there. It helps you forward as you write. You'll start slow, but then things start to pick up. Your mind feels tested and it is ready for the challenge. Your instincts come to life and then you make a mistake. Something you wrote didn't feel right, or there were so many grammar mistakes or spelling errors that the red lines are just too distracting. You begin to stutter, and the desire to correct those mistakes grows. These are mental breaks that destroy your flow, and soon you are spending time fixing your work. But correcting one's mistakes, is that a bad thing? Well, it really depends on when you decide to do so. During the writing process, you're in the swing of things. You literally have a writing flow. It's easier to get a lot more writing done when you just keep pushing forward. But when you stop to take the time to correct some mistakes, you then lose that momentum, and then it gets a bit more difficult to start it all back up again. Or even worse, you might make mistakes going back and correcting your work instead of pushing forward, and then you only pick up on them during the actual editing phase. And fussing over mistakes all the time and trying to correct them is also a bad cycle to be in, mentally, because you're constantly seeing the mistakes rather than the progress. Simple solution is to write now and edit later. Once your book is done, you can go back, read through it, and make the adjustments as necessary. But when you are writing, you need to focus on what you're writing in that moment and what is to come, and not what you have already written. Tip number 3 is to not waste your inspiration. Of course, when you feel the most inspired is the ideal time to write. All sorts of ideas are forming in your mind and swirling around like snow in a snow globe. These are words ready to be written. But are you at your desk? Do you have access to your phone? A notepad? Inspiration can be wasted for many good reasons though. We all have responsibilities and they will always take priority. Yet, are you addressing a problem in your life? Or are you spending your time surfing the internet, watching YouTube, or browsing Instagram or Pinterest? Are you tackling some other hobby that can wait, or are you just burning time with something a bit more entertaining, but less productive? If you can confidently say that you're not wasting your time, that you are doing something productive or you're learning something new, then by all means, carry on. But if you can't say that, then perhaps it's time to start writing. Tip 4 is to use vague plans. The planning process with any creative project is important. Artists find references, sketch something, perhaps even do a practice painting or two before they start. For writers, it's to plot the story, structure, the pacing, character notes, and so on. Unfortunately, most do too much. As a victim of this in the past, let me explain the problem. There is a mentality that a great plan will help you overcome every obstacle. Having an accurate idea of every scene in a novel will help productivity and prevent any writer's block. There won't be any excuses not to write, because you have exactly what to write explained in a short paragraph. It all sounds great in theory, but in practice it hits many bumps. During the writing process, you'll find that there are many parts that you did not foresee. Some scenes don't exactly turn out as planned, but they turn out better, because in that moment, you start to understand the characters, the emotions, and the feeling that you're trying to create a lot better than you were when you were planning it. So then the scene takes a different direction. You can always just veer back, but then at some point, you can't exactly force them in the right direction. It just doesn't make sense anymore. Suddenly, your plan is a bit too restrictive. Your story is now being forced in a direction that it was never meant to go. And of course, you can still force it and just say, I'll fix it in the editing. But by the end, you'll have a book that you're not going to be happy with. The results will feel wrong. The characters will be broken. The story's flow would be non-existent. It is important to trust your own instincts as you move along. So should you write a book without a plan at all and give yourself that much freedom? Well, that doesn't work either, because then you're not sure exactly where you're going. And sometimes that can be a bad thing. Sometimes your instincts can lead you to a dead end. So what you need, in fact, is just landmarks. And that is what a vague plan is. Landmarks. To give you a sense of direction, but not tell you exactly what road to take. It all comes down to giving yourself some room to breathe, taking advantage of the creative freedom that this medium provides. Tip number 5 is to read dialogue aloud because it might sound wrong. Many writers will struggle with dialogue, and no doubt there are various exchanges in your story that just didn't seem right. However, a lot of writers believe it comes down to their characters, how their words don't fit, and then they look to their personalities to create dialogues that emphasize that character. It works sometimes, but most of the time, that is not the core problem. The biggest problem might be the dialogue sounding wrong when said aloud. Whenever you feel that your dialogue is lacking, simply just read it aloud. It can give you a better idea of what is the problem area. Some words just won't sound right when said aloud, but seem right when written on paper. This is a very simple tip, but also a very important one. It's very useful for any writer, be they experienced or beginner. Plus, it's one of the tips that you can have a lot of fun with. You can put some emotion into the dialogue, even act out the scene, so you can get a better idea of how the characters would feel. Tip number 6 is don't concern yourself with money just yet. A more serious tip for the writers. I won't sugarcoat it. Writing is one of the most difficult careers to start. But there are many ways one can make money from it. Sending one's work to publishers, working for fiction websites, starting your blog posts, and building a following, self-publishing, and marketing your books. You can take your pick. But if you are starting from scratch, you might be disappointed with the income you receive, if any. Many writers who jump into writing with dollar signs in their eyes are disappointed. Most will drop it and pursue something else, which in many cases is a good thing. They have responsibilities that writing cannot help them look after. Yet I believe it is a waste of talent when someone abandons something that initially interested them for the right reasons, but greed took over. The right reasons being the desire to create something that they would enjoy, something that they can be proud of. Unfortunately, money is a very important part of almost everyone's life today. So when it comes down to it, how does one make money from writing? Well, it takes a lot of luck in the very beginning. If you are lucky, you can make a decent income. If you are very lucky, you might be able to pitch your book to a publisher and they accept it, a big publisher, and then all sorts of wonderful things can happen from there. But what you really need to do is approach writing with the right mindset. You need to be content with just writing itself. It might just be something of a hobby that you do in your spare time, but you are happy to do so because it is something you enjoy. But if you start to spoil that experience and start to try and validate your work only by the money that comes from it, then you'll be very disappointed, and that could leave a bad taste in your mouth when it comes to writing. And that's just a shame. It will harshly affect your emotions when it comes to writing, and it will harshly affect your writing as well. So it's best to enjoy writing for what it is, and then accept the rewards as they come. Of course, if you are more ambitious, you can always approach writing as a business, but that's an entire conversation by itself. For now, let's move on to the next tip. Tip number 7 is try to get a second opinion. Either when writing or reading their work, a writer will sometimes feel their writing is missing something, or that something is wrong, and they just don't see the problem. In which case, it might be time to get a second writer. I know that isn't easy. I'm shy about sharing my work with someone, along with many other writers. Most writers are introverted, making it a common problem. It's hard to take something that you aren't completely happy with and ask a friend or family member for their opinion. Yet, their perspective can do your writing a world of good. If they are honest, they will tell you what they don't like as well as what they like. From this, you can take their advice and decide for yourself if it has merit. Chances are that some of the advice will make sense and you can use it to rewrite a scene or two, or perhaps add something throughout the book. If you approach it with an open mind, getting a second opinion becomes a big part of any good writer's process. So you always have that option. If you ever hit a problem in your writing, you can always turn to a friend or family member and ask them what they think the problem is. Or you can join my writer's workshop and ask me. Tip number 8 is to start simple. For the beginner writer who feels the powerful feeling of inspiration, you probably want to tackle writing a book with all that you have. Usually that means starting with a strong first chapter that sets a detailed scene, places all the important pieces, and gives the reader all the information they need to know to read the book. In other words, most writers will bombard the reader with their ideas and hope that every nugget of information is a hit. I'm here to tell you that the first chapter, along with many others, need to be simple ones. The reader may not know your world, its characters, its relations, which might seem like a good opportunity to teach them as much as possible before it starts. But the opposite is true. Information requires pacing just as much as the story. Many writers forget this and create a first chapter filled with too much exposition and too little story. Start simple, set the scene, follow a character. Use dialogue and actions to explore the details as the story goes on. Try not to break pacing with huge clusters of info, but keep pacing by introducing discovery and learning experiences along the way. Now, I know there's this big talk about the first chapter being so incredibly important, and in some ways it is. It is the first impression that you have on the reader that matters. But here's the thing. The first impression is simply their way of determining if your writing is a good fit for them. It's simply a part of your novel. If the reader enjoys it, it means that they like your style and they're going to keep reading and you're going to be consistent throughout, so they are going to be happy. But if you stress so much about the first chapter, there's a chance to jeopardize your writing style because of that anxiety. Your first chapter could be a flop and they decide not to read anymore. Or your first chapter really does capture a reader, but then the rest of your book doesn't match it. So then they also drop it. So at the end of the day, just approach the first chapter as you would any other. Tip number 9 is to surround yourself with inspirations. There will be many mental blocks that keep you from writing. Unlike responsibilities and chores, these are blocks that cannot be dealt with so easily. It comes down to attitude and sometimes willpower. If you have been writing for a long time, you might experience what is known as burnout. You feel mentally tapped when it comes to writing, a feeling that ultimately makes you reject the idea of sitting down and continuing your story. You could have the energy, your mind could have the energy, but the burnout keeps you from writing. Or you might have reached a dead end in your story. You lack the ideas or creative flow to continue the story, or rewrite the points that brought you to that dead end. Depending on how far you are in this book, this can be a nuisance or it can be soul-crushing. Whatever the block, you are in dire need of inspiration, which can come in many forms. Many writers are inspired by other writers, so simply reading books that are of the same genre or plot structure might help. Some writers like to look at artworks, listen to music, watch shows or movies, or engage in any form of creative medium that gives them that spark to relight the flame. You need to fully realize what your inspirations are and surround yourself with them. It will help you maintain that passion for writing and avoid these blocks and burnouts. Think of it much like those cliche scenes where you have an office building and you have these very gloomy office workers at their desk, and then there's this colorful poster of a kitten hanging off a branch, and it simply says, "Hang in there." Well, it's kind of like that, except this inspiration will actually work. Tip 10 is to take short breaks. Of course, one of the biggest solutions to almost every problem is taking a short break. Want to be more productive? Take a short break before you burn out. Want to find inspiration? Take a break and enjoy your inspirations. Want to improve your writing? Take a break and analyze other writers, do some research. Or hey, watch some of my videos. I'm happy to answer questions, and it means a lot to me if my work helps another. A nice short break, be it a day or two, is enough to refresh a writer, so that way they can approach writing with a better mindset. The key point I'm trying to make of this tip though is that the break does need to be short. After 2 or 3 days, it's easy enough to get back into writing, but after a week, it's easy for the mind and body to become content with not writing, in which case it becomes a struggle to get back into the flow of things. It requires a lot of inspiration, a big push to do so. Every writer is different, so that's really up to you to decide. And with that, these 10 tips have come to an end. And these are tips that I believe will help every writer, whether they are ambitious writers looking to improve their writing skill set, or they are simply writers who want to maintain their passion for writing instead of burn out or lose the enjoyment that they have with writing. Now I'd like to hear what advice you would give to a writer. What lessons have you learned from your writing experience that they could learn as well, no matter who they are or what genre they work with? Let me know these tips in the comments below. If you want to check out more of my work, you can find it all on thepensleuth.com, along with a free course which I highly recommend you check out. And if you enjoyed this video, be sure to leave a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Thank you so much for listening, and as always, good day, good night, and happy writing.